Hey everyone, this is Amy Berger. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a paleo, low carb, and ketogenic oriented nutritionist, and it's really a thrill and an honor to be talking to the Adapt Live audience because I've been a huge fan of Dr. Westman's work for many years. Even long before I was a professional nutritionist, when I was just dabbling in low carb for myself and my own issues, I remember reading his papers, and now he is one of the co-authors on the New Atkins for a New You. So I'm very familiar with Dr. Westman, and it's just a real treat to be talking to his audience. My apologies that I couldn't do this as a Facebook Live. I am a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to technology, and I just was having some technical problems recording on my phone. So hopefully this will be okay and you can still watch it and get something out of it. I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I don't think gets enough attention in the low carb and ketogenic community, and that's Alzheimer's disease. Most of you are probably familiar with, low carb and ketogenic diets for fat loss and for managing type 2 diabetes, PCOS, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. The conditions run the gamut that this way of eating is effective for. But the scientific literature and the medical journals now regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain, or brain insulin resistance. Now, some of you might have heard of this concept. I've been on a couple of podcasts. There's a handful of other low-carb nutritionists and doctors who are aware of this issue, but it really doesn't get as much play in the low-carb community as some of these other conditions that we use this way of eating for. But the medical journals now regularly refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. So right off the bat, we know there's at least some connection to glucose and or insulin in the brain. And where this sort of concept of type 3 diabetes comes from is that the major flaw in the Alzheimer's brain, the primary problem, is that neurons in affected regions of the brain have lost the ability to harness energy from glucose. So I like to call Alzheimer's disease a metabolic problem. And by metabolic, I mean it has to do with the way the brain produces and utilizes energy. Alzheimer's disease is essentially a fuel crisis. It's an energy shortage in the brain. And when these neurons lose the ability to metabolize glucose, they start to atrophy and they wither, and eventually, very late in the disease process, they actually die. And this can be measured on MRIs. They can actually see the volume of your brain shrinking. Now, the crazy thing about this is, everybody knows Alzheimer's disease is it's a progressive disease, right? Nobody wakes up all of a sudden with severe dementia. This is something that starts in a mild form. It's actually called mild cognitive impairment. And over time, it progresses toward, early stage Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's, until you have severe Alzheimer's. And it starts mildly, but what nobody really is talking about is that this decline in what they call the cerebral metabolic rate of glucose, the rate at which your brain is using glucose, or parts of your brain are using glucose, this decline can be measured by PET scan in people as young as their 30s and 40s. So this is not an illness that strikes people in their 80s and 90s anymore. They used to joke and call this old-timers disease instead of Alzheimer's, right? Because it used to be years and years ago that this was something that primarily struck very older people, somebody's grandparents, somebody's spouse when they were in their 80s or 90s. But we're no longer talking about very, very elderly people. We're talking about people in their 50s and 60s becoming afflicted with this. And the thing is, in the same way of type 2 diabetes, in the same way of cardiovascular disease, by the time your body is showing signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, the disease process has been in place for years and in some cases decades. Like I said, this decline in the brain's glucose metabolism is observable, measurable in people's 30s and 40s. So when somebody's young, when somebody's at that age, the brain is able to compensate. You're more robust, you're younger, your brain can make up for this glucose deficit. But over time, as this gets worse and worse, you reach kind of a tipping point where the brain is no longer able to compensate. And that's when memory starts declining. That's when you start forgetting things. That's when the personality changes happen. But the disease process has been in place for years. Now, one thing I want to clarify, and I really hope this audience is aware of what I'm going to say now. When we say type 3 diabetes, we're not just talking about blood sugar. If anyone out here watching is familiar with Dr. Joseph Kraft or Ivor Cummins, who's brought Dr. Kraft's work back to the forefront, Dr. Kraft discovered something that he called diabetes in situ, or occult diabetes. And what this means is, through doing some oral glucose tolerance test, that's where you drink a pure glucose liquid solution and the doctor measures your blood glucose at intervals after that. Well, Dr. Kraft developed what is now called the Kraft Test. It's an oral glucose tolerance test, but instead of only testing glucose, they test insulin. And instead of only doing the test for 2 hours, which is the standard, they extend it to 5 hours. So the Kraft test is an oral glucose tolerance test with an insulin test, and it's a 5-hour test. And what Dr. Kraft discovered was frankly fascinating. I mean, it blew my mind when I learned about it. I wrote a very long blog series about it because it's that important. What he discovered is that there are quite literally millions, without exaggeration, millions of people walking around who have perfectly normal blood glucose fasting, perfectly normal A1C, and even many times a normal glucose response to the oral glucose tolerance test. But those things are only normal because the blood glucose is being kept in check by very, very high insulin. And in so many diseases, so many chronic, modern conditions, it's actually the insulin that's generating the pathology more so than the glucose, more so than the hyperglycemia. It's the hyperinsulinemia, the chronically high insulin. So a lot of issues that are tied to high insulin with or without normal blood glucose, PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, we know that's a hyperinsulinemic condition. Gout, erectile dysfunction, BPH, benign prostate hypertrophy. Did I say hypertension? Abdominal obesity. You know how if you see someone with kind of thinner arms and legs, but they look like they've got a beach ball in their abdomen, they used to call that a beer belly. Dr. William Davis wrote the book called Wheat Belly. Some low-carb doctors call that an insulin pouch. So that abdominal obesity, high triglycerides and low HDL, a dead giveaway that you have high insulin, skin tags. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Another condition that we can absolutely add to this list is Alzheimer's disease. So when I say type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the blood glucose level. Because if you know somebody with this condition, you might be thinking, well, gee, my grandma's not diabetic. Or, my husband has, early stage dementia, but he's not diabetic. I can almost guarantee you that they're not diabetic, but they're hyperinsulinemic. And the only reason they're not actually diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic is because their glucose is normal. And that's a huge, huge problem with how type 2 diabetes is diagnosed. It's only diagnosed by blood glucose. They never factor in insulin. They don't even factor in insulin when they evaluate someone for metabolic syndrome, right? Which used to be called insulin-resistant syndrome. It involves hypertension, low HDL, high triglycerides, abdominal obesity, I think an elevated fasting glucose or A1C, if I remember correctly. But the one thing that is not included in the official diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome is elevated insulin. It's crazy. So the point here is that millions upon millions of people are having cognitive decline and cognitive impairment and eventually Alzheimer's disease due to chronically high insulin. And the reason it's being missed is because nobody's looking for it. Nobody's testing insulin. Now, there are a lot of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. It's most definitely not a multifactorial condition. It's not the case that you can just, consume excess carbohydrate for many years and you'll develop Alzheimer's. There's other factors playing into it, but we could say the same about type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and all the rest. The simplest, most fundamental intervention is a low-carb diet. But before we get to some of the other interventions that I think are effective for this, some of the other risk factors for Alzheimer's include the ApoE4 genotype. So that's why, this kind of runs in families. There's kind of a genetic aspect to it. But regardless of your genetics, regardless of your family history, regardless of just about any other risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, one of the common denominators is hyperinsulinemia. If you have chronically high insulin, you are at greater risk for Alzheimer's regardless of anything else. And this ApoE4 genotype, I'm sure, you're a very savvy audience. You are very educated in most of this. I'm sure many of you have heard of the ApoE4 gene. Now, the thing to know, they actually call it the Alzheimer's gene, but that's really sort of unfair because, ApoE4 is not required to cause Alzheimer's. And what that means is there are millions of people who do not carry the ApoE4 gene who have Alzheimer's disease, and there are millions of people who carry not one but two copies of the E4 gene, and they do not have Alzheimer's. So they say that E4 is neither required nor sufficient to bring about Alzheimer's disease. The really fascinating thing about this E4 genotype is it is believed that the E4 is the oldest, sort of most simian, most monkey-like, if you will, most ape-like allele of the ApoE gene, this 4. The ApoE2 and ApoE3 are believed to have evolved later in human evolution. And so the ApoE4 gene was forged really in our hunter-gatherer days. And the E4 was selected against in human populations with a longer consumption of grain-based agriculture. So the ApoE4 has a lower incidence in places like East Asia and the Middle East and Mesoamerica, where they were eating more rice, wheat, and corn, respectively. So the ApoE4 doesn't cause Alzheimer's disease. What it means is that the people that carry the E4 gene are the least suited toward the modern diet, which is so heavy in refined carbohydrates and in total carbohydrates, but really in the refined. So it's not that E4 is inherently dangerous by itself. ApoE4 does not cause Alzheimer's. It increases the susceptibility to this condition in the context of the crazy modern diet that is so high in these refined carbs. And it's probably not just the refined carbs. There's probably a role for excess omega-6 fatty acid intake, other nutrient deficiencies, B12 deficiency, zinc deficiency, choline deficiency. So it's definitely multifactorial, but, in looking at the E4 gene, it just is the least suited and the worst mismatch for the modern diet. What else? Let's talk about the beta amyloid. If you are interested in Alzheimer's disease research, you've probably heard of the term beta amyloid. A lot of researchers think that this protein fragment causes Alzheimer's, and there's a new school of thought that is actually saying the amyloid is protective. It's kind of like cholesterol in that it's actually a protective, very helpful substance that has gotten a bad reputation, and it's sort of been wrongfully accused and misunderstood for years, if not decades. And every single drug that has been developed to go after these amyloid proteins that form these plaques in the brain that literally get in the way of synapses, they get in the way of neurons in our brain being able to communicate with each other. These plaques are secreted in response to neuronal injury. In the same way that cholesterol is reparative, the amyloid is reparative. We also see great amounts of amyloid in traumatic brain injury for the same reason. It's protective. I could go into detail. I wish we had more time. I'm supposed to keep this video kind of short. But the bottom line is, every single drug that's been developed to target these amyloid proteins and plaques has been a total failure. You would think that if these plaques are causing Alzheimer's disease, if we could develop a drug that reduces the plaques, well, check, Alzheimer's is cured, there's your magic bullet. But every single drug has failed in the sense that it does actually reduce the formation of amyloid, but the reduction of the amyloid does nothing to stop the disease progression. It does nothing to stop the Alzheimer's, the cognitive decline from getting worse. It's kind of like statins, where statins do lower cholesterol, but having lower cholesterol does not guarantee you a life free of heart attack or heart disease. It's kind of like an association causation thing, the cholesterol and heart disease. It's the same way with the amyloid and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, there was one drug developed to target these amyloid proteins that the phase 3 clinical trial had to be stopped early because the people on the drug were faring so much worse than the people on the placebo. They deemed it unethical to continue. So these plaques are not causing Alzheimer's disease, or if they are contributing, they're not the main factor. Again, I could say more. I see the clock ticking down. I'm running out of time. I will leave you with knowing that low carb and ketogenic diets are a very, very elegant, beautiful, and simple intervention for Alzheimer's disease. Why? The reduced brain metabolism is specific to glucose. When the brain is losing energy and these neurons are withering and they're no longer communicating with each other because they're starting to atrophy and shrivel up, the fuel that they become unable to use is glucose. Oddly enough, these debilitated, sort of struggling, starving neurons can still use ketones. And they've shown this not only in animals, not only in mice. Thank goodness we don't have to rely on petri dish studies for these, although that's been done too. They've shown this in human subjects with mild cognitive impairment, with Alzheimer's disease, not with very, very severe disease, but older people with diagnosed Alzheimer's disease. When they get their ketones elevated, whether it's through exogenous ketones, ketone supplements, or MCT oil, or a ketogenic diet, when these people's ketone levels are elevated, they have better cognition. Now, what is the extent to which a low-carb or ketogenic diet could actually reverse some of the damage that's been done rather than simply fueling the brain and providing that brain energy in the short term? That research kind of remains to be done. I personally think there's probably no better intervention than a low-carb diet, because the exogenous ketones and the MCT oil are kind of a short-term fix, right? They will provide these starving neurons with fuel, but why are the neurons starving in the first place? Maybe all along they're down-regulating their use of glucose because glucose in high amounts can be toxic. I mean, I dislike that word toxic. It can be damaging, right? It causes a lot of free radicals. It causes a lot of, oxidative stress in the brain, in the neuronal mitochondria. So the brain might just be looking for an alternative fuel. And the only problem is that in most people consuming a high-carb diet, that alternative fuel, which we all know as ketones, is not available. And it's not available because most people's insulin is sky high all the time, right? Ketones are only produced endogenously, meaning inside us, when our insulin levels are low. And when we don't have enough carbohydrate coming in to keep the brain fueled, the brain and the body have to switch over to using fatty acids, which generate ketones. So I think the real double whammy, if you will, the 1-2 punch, is a ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones. I think that a ketogenic diet stands a chance of undoing some of the damage, of undoing some of the oxidative stress, of undoing some of the neuronal atrophy, rather than simply treating the acute symptom, putting a Band-Aid on it. So I would love to say more. If you'd like to learn more about this, I've written a book called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and you can find it on Amazon. It's available in the US. I'm not sure if it's available overseas yet. So if you're watching this in another country besides the US, check on Amazon or check with your local bookseller to see if they would carry this. My website is Tuit Nutrition, TUIT nutrition.com. Again, I'm sorry this wasn't a live video, but if anyone has questions about this, feel free to email me. You can contact me through my blog, through my website, or my email is toitnutrition@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer questions about this, but really, I gave you the little teaser. All the details are in my book, and I think that considering there are absolutely no effective pharmaceutical drugs for this condition, none, then you have truly nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain by implementing a ketogenic or low-carb diet for Alzheimer's. Now, if someone in your life is already affected with this, especially if they're already in a severe or advanced disease state, they're probably not going to be willing to do a keto diet, right? You're not going to get someone who's 78 or 85 years old to change their diet overnight and ditch their morning bagel and orange juice in favor of eggs scrambled in coconut oil. In those cases, I absolutely support the use of larger amounts of coconut and MCT oil or exogenous ketones. But for someone who's a little younger and still has enough of their cognition intact that they're willing and able to make a dramatic change to their diet, then I absolutely support a low-carb or ketogenic diet, possibly in conjunction with exogenous ketones, but why not hit this with everything we've got? Do the diet and the ketones. And if I can leave you with one thought, it's that this is absolutely not a hopeless situation. Alzheimer's disease may be treatable. At the very, very least, we might be able to delay the progression and improve the afflicted person's quality of life and their loved ones and caregivers' quality of life. Those are the people who suffer the most, the loved ones that have to watch their family members sort of disappear and decline. So please, your low-carb, ketogenic, high-fat diet is good for so many things, and let me reinforce how good it is for the brain. So thank you for watching. Thank you to Adapt Live. Thank you to Dr. Westman and Glenn and everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. Have a great day. Thank you.